Hey, Renter Retires, it's Adam Schroeder here with another episode, joined as usual by Zach Lemaster, the founder and CEO of Renter Retirement. And we are pleased to be joined today by Jesse Vasquez, a real estate investor and a midterm rental expert at AirVenture. Jesse, thanks for joining us.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
So tell us a little bit about how you caught the real estate bug. And I want to hear not only what your first rental was, but we're going to be talking, I mentioned you're a midterm rental expert. When did you first hear the term midterm rental?
Well, I thought I made it up, but I guess I didn't. It's been around for a long time. Midterm rentals are folks who stay at properties for 30 days at a time. And it's been around forever. I heard about it, worked in healthcare for 17 years. As I worked in these different hospitals all over the U.S., I started to see travel nurses. And one particular nurse, her name was Barbara. She had one of these badass accents from North Dakota. And you guys probably, Zach, let's hear what that North Dakota accent sounds like. If you want to just give us.
Oh, let's have a freshie. We're out and about.
There you go. Yeah. So she said,
I don't even know what a freshie is.
They say, oh, and don't you know, and isn't he a doll, stuff like that. And that probably I just butchered it. But anyway, I met her. I saw her. I heard her speaking at a nursing station, and I was in Modesto, California, where I'm actually from. And her voice drew me in. I asked her what she was doing in Modesto, and she said she was a travel nurse. I asked her where she was staying, and you would not believe she was staying at one of the worst hotels in Modesto. It was actually a motel, and it was Motel 6 on 9th Street, paying $3,000 a month. And at that time in 2015, I didn't own any real estate. I didn't care about real estate. It wasn't really on my radar, but I could buy a house in 2015 in Modesto for $250,000. My mortgage would be about $1,300, $1,400. And I thought I could make money from that. So she had told me, go ahead and head over to the HR department downstairs of the hospital, which if you guys have ever been in a hospital, you have to have a little badge, right? You got to badge in to get into these places. And my job at that time was a sales rep, so I had no problem going into places that I wasn't supposed to go. So I watched a nurse badge in. She went into one of the HR rooms, and as the door was closing, Zach, Adam, imagine the door shutting. All of a sudden, in a movie, he pans down to the bottom, and you see this size 12 shoe just stop there right before the door shuts. And I opened it up, and I go in there, and I talked to a woman named Misty, and Misty was an HR representative. She was the manager of the Doctors Hospital HR, facility there, and she said, "Yeah, we actually have travel nurses that are coming to these markets. They don't have anywhere to stay." We're seeing a lot of issues with these folks. They're staying in crappy motels. They're staying in accommodations that aren't worthwhile for them, and they're not safe. And we would love for you to be able to do that. So I essentially got a contract with the hospital, and I started looking for a house. So within about 3 months, I picked up my first property in Modesto because of that need. It was a need that I saw, and I just jumped on it. And it was an opportunity, and I could see it. And here we are today, 9 years later. If I didn't make that decision to put my foot in the door and show up somewhere where I wasn't invited to go in, I wouldn't be here talking to you guys right now, which is crazy, right?
Yeah. So was Misty your first tenant, or had she already moved on?
No, Misty was an HR representative, but what she did was
the North Dakotan nurse. Sorry, I got the name mixed up there.
Barb. No, she didn't end up staying with me. She actually did 6 months later. She ended up staying in Modesto for a year as a travel nurse. They usually do 90 days at a time, so they'll have assignments for 90 days, but she ended up staying with us 6 months later. But she gave me the information for Misty, which allowed me to start that conversation, and that was where I got the idea, and it went from there. So, it's a crazy story. It's just one of those simple little things that you wouldn't think would be a game changer, but that's exactly what it is, just putting my foot in the door, and that's what opened the opportunity.
Jesse, was that your first entry into real estate, though, is into the midterm space, or had you done real estate prior to that?
No, I watched my parents get into real estate, and real quick, I'll jump on this real quick. As a child, my parents were, and you guys might have seen people like this before, where they're not business minded, so they had property. I grew up in a super Catholic household, so my parents were super forgiving. If somebody didn't pay rent, my dad would say things like, "Oh, they have kids; they'll pay next month." And when I was about 9 years old, I ended up in a courthouse with my parents, and they were kicking a tenant out. So that happened over the next probably 4 or 5 years, 9 all the way to about 13, 14. So I was introduced to the ugliest side of real estate, you guys. I had no ambition to get into it. My parents owned a bunch of homes, and I watched them kind of slowly sell them off over the years. So it wasn't something I was really, keen to. But even then, all those things happen. My dad would always like, buy real estate, like this is what you want to do. And I'm thinking to myself, like, well, you buy real estate and you let people stay there for free. But again, he didn't have that mindset to, separate business and personal and, everything else in between. So I wasn't thinking about it at all. And just
that was the first experience was midterm rel though. That's it could be because you saw the opportunity and also the ability to serve someone that was, a workforce nurse that had not ideal housing accommodations, right? And like that's an opportunity both from a business perspective, but also to like just help someone improve their living conditions. I love that. Can you break down what I know you talk about 30 days on average, but like expand a little bit beyond that. What is midterm rentals? We've heard of short-term rentals, we've heard of long-term rentals. At Rent Retirement, we do both, and we're partnering with you guys to do to start offering some of these midterm rental options. And what's attractive to me is the fact that in the right location, you can have a property that's traditionally a long-term rental that you possibly could operate as a midterm rental without that much additional work or any additional work and dramatically increase the cash flow of it. That's the big thing that's attractive to me, and also have quality tenants. But let's hear it from you. Like, what baseline is a midterm rental?
Yeah. So if you're looking at, I look at it as 3 classifications. You have the short term, right, which is like 1, 2 days, 3 days, 7 days, 10 days. And then you have obviously long-term rent, which is folks that are there for a year. And then right smack in the middle is you have midterm. And again, that's 30 days staying at a time. And the crazy thing about this too, Zach, is there's multiple different types of like avatars that you can go after, where traditionally like your short term, you have families, you have, bachelorette parties, you have like these certain kinds of avatars, and you create your property specifically towards those tenants. In the midterm space, these folks are looking to live in the home for a certain amount of time. So we house displaced families that lose their home due to fire, floods. Those are the big payday. You can make 5x long-term rental rates. But even travel,
from the insurance company on that, right?
Insurance companies are the most lucrative type of real estate tenants that are available now. And it's because obviously insurance companies, if you guys go back and look and even Google this, insurance companies have made the most amount of money, more than banks. And we all have these policies on our homes. We have to. It's the law requirement, right? We have to have insurance on our homes. And if somebody loses their home due to a fire or a flood, which happens every 88 seconds in the United States, you can pick up these claims, but you have to talk to these companies like ALE Solutions or CRS or Dan Housing. They're temporary housing relocation companies. And what we do is we have a huge network that is attached to them. And we service their clients. We work with them on a regular basis. And yes, they do pay extremely well. So you have this wide, diverse group of individuals, people, families, doctors, travelers, occupational therapists, engineers, construction workers. Those are all the types of folks that we're essentially housing in these 30-day stays. And you mentioned something a minute ago. The thing that I love about the midterm rental guests is that they are on assignment. They're not there to squat. I've heard a lot of stories about people like, oh, I would never midterm, especially in California, because people will squat. Well, most of my portfolio is in California, and I got some properties in Texas too. But these are folks that are traveling, they're working, they're not going to want to squat. They're on assignment. They're jamming out when they're done. Like, they're not looking to live in that area. They're just there to do a job and then get out. And a lot of times we can actually get the companies to be the lessees on these on the leases, which is great. It's not the individuals, the actual agencies or the companies that we're working with. So that gives me a little bit of validity. I can sleep at night knowing that these folks are going to pay. And I think subconsciously, Zach, that's why I got into midterm rentals, because I watched my parents. I probably should talk to my therapist about this, huh? I watched my parents go through all that craziness as a child. So I saw that opportunity where a company could pay. And that's essentially how I started to build my business, is having these companies and agencies and hospitals actually be the lessee on these properties.
Yeah, it's not just traveling nurses, right? Because when we first learn about midterm rentals, the most common occupation is traveling nurses, which traveling nurses are great. My sister and brother-in-law have a couple, they converted their short-term rentals in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which are like, what's the draw to Cheyenne, Wyoming? But they operate them as midterm rentals, just workforce housing for people like you exactly said, that are on a rotation schedule. One of my first properties, I accidentally I wasn't even aware there's a midterm rental until years later, but it was at a military base. And we would have people come in on assignments for 3 months at a time. and they would find the next tenants, right? They would find the next guys coming in, and they would do training, and then it was a complete military. It was like a long-term type of tenant, but it was people rotating, and they were all very professional tenants, and we did better than likely having a long-term tenant in place. So very, very interesting concept. Adam, I cut you off. What was your question you're going to ask?
First off, I was going to say, traveling nurses is the first words I hear out of people's mouths.
Yeah.
Every time you hear that. But when it comes to, finding just the rate that you should be charging, how are you doing that? Because, we hear about, Air DNA for short-term rentals, and you can obviously talk to your, you can look on Zillow or stuff for, single-family rentals. You can talk to property managers about that. But whenever I think about a midterm rental, I wouldn't even know where to begin when it comes to pricing out the rent. And I know it's higher than the long-term rental rate, but it's probably not as high as if you're doing a short-term rental. So how do you find that sweet spot?
Yeah, well, actually, Adam, you do bounce a little bit of short-term rental numbers off these. Now, midterm rentals, there's a lot of, and you guys, we obviously talked about this. There's a lot of nuances that come along with it. There's no software out there. So if anybody's a software engineer and you want to get into there's a lot of money to be made. So Zach, we probably should be thinking about this right now. But what we do
part out so y'all can have a business venture is what I'm hearing.
Well, I'll keep it in here. Maybe somebody will reach out that's works for Apple or something and is like, I'm ready to do something like that. There's just not any software other than Price Labs that allows you to see 30 days at a time. And you have to pay for it. We use MashVisor, we use AirDNA, and that gives us short-term rental numbers. And we look at the last year of what they've earned. But we'll also go back and look at like extended stay hotels, because that's one of the biggest competitors on the midterm rental side. A lot of hotels like Marriott, Hilton, they're actually starting to create midterm rental extended stay hotels too. So if you start to see these big companies, in the hotel industry do this, then there's some huge opportunities. So yeah, we look on AirDNA, we look on MashVisor, we take a 10 to 15% variance. So if a property makes, $10,000 a month, we're taking that 10% and we're saying it's going to be $9,000 a month as a midterm. And typically a rule of thumb for me is to try to 2x long-term rental rate. So if it's, $2,000 a month, we're looking at $4,000. That would be my goal. And we would have to go in and try to find, does this property match with another on AirDNA? Does it match with a property on Furnish Finder? Does it match with a property? If we were to do extended stays, one room, if that's $200 a night, we're looking at what the average daily rate is if we were to have a 3-bedroom. So there's a lot of variances that come along with it. But that's kind of confusing. But again, you always use reference for AirDNA. I always go back to that and just say, hey, add 10 to 15% variance as a decrease. And that gives you a good example. If you find a comp that's similar, what you could potentially earn in the space.
Yeah, like anything, you got to test out the market, right? And see where, like, if your place is fully booked all the time, maybe you have the ability to increase the rents. If no one's booking, then probably you're too high, But
yeah.
Furnish Finder is, I think, the booking site that a lot of people use to identify midterm rentals or medium-term rentals. And so that's a place you could also look for comps if there's any comps in your area. And if there's not any, that may be a sign that there's an opportunity, right? Just because there's no other properties in that area, maybe there's that don't take that as no demand. We found out empirically that that's potentially an area where there's untapped opportunity, and you could bring that, because there is the beautiful thing I like about midterm rentals is the fact that, like, for a short-term rental, for example, you pretty much have to be in an area where you have consistent demand or traveling. There's something drawing someone to that area to vacation.
Right.
Whereas in midterm rental, it's not so much a vacationer. It could be. And another thing to talk about is a hybrid model, right? Where you have a short-term rental that's like 3 months during peak season, and maybe it's a midterm rental during the other 9 months during off season or something like that to really maximize your profitability. But midterm rentals, they can work in a lot of locations that short-term rentals would not work. And so it may be worth exploring. I was going to ask you about the average that you see increase in rents above the long-term rentals, and you mentioned 2x.
Yeah, that's a gold star standard. Like for us, when we're looking at markets, we're trying to shoot for that 2x. And Zach, one of the things that you just talked about, you don't have to be in these metro areas. You're absolutely right. In fact, I have a student that he worked for one of those big windmill companies. I don't know if you guys have those out where you're at. He's actually in Ohio, random place in the middle of nowhere. But they would contract these guys to come out every year to work in these windmills. And there was literally, like, I don't remember how many, I think he said 90 guys a year that came out, and they were staying for 3 months at a time. He built his business just around that company, around housing those specific folks that worked on those windmills. and that was it. He's 25 years old and has 16 properties now, and that's the contract that he has. So it's like, again, going back to what I initially talked about, is those opportunities are probably in our backyard, but after this episode, people are going to start to think about that in a different way, where all you have to do is land this one company or Frito-Lay or Gallo Winery. Like I have a couple, contracts with these companies, and it's like, you don't think about them until you start hearing people talk about it and think like, oh, there is opportunity there, because they have these folks that come down, they have these people that come out and work every 3 months. And it's definitely possible. You just have to put yourself out there and start to think about it.
Yeah, so not just healthcare, education. You think about manufacturing, really any business. I mean, especially industrial wise, that brings in rotational workers would be something to think about. But let's break down the numbers just real quick, because midterm is different than a long-term rental. You need to furnish the house, right? So that's there's potentially more expenses. You can acquire the property. I mean, one thing you could potentially do is if you have a long-term rental, and this is something you want to explore. I mean, you could possibly run some preliminary research to see if it would make sense, if you'd have demand, to operate as a midterm rental and convert it to a midterm rental. You could always do that. The areas, because rent to retirement is starting to offer some of these midterm rental opportunities where, people can either self-manage those and kind of get the resources that they need, which I know you teach people with, Jesse, or they can also have you guys just manage them as well. So they can actually be passive turnkey investment properties, sometimes new construction, where, we assist with everything from furnishing, acquiring the property, and then they could be more passive where you manage for them, or they could self-manage. But let's talk about the operational and the numbers on a midterm rental. So we've already established that this could be a property that's, really anywhere, depending if there's demand for rotational, workforce housing. We need to furnish the house. What is typical furnishing? I think you said $12 a square foot. Give us an idea about furnishing costs.
Furnishing, I like to stick around $10 a square foot, 10 to 15. So $10 would be like your Wayfair type stuff. I mean, if you get some things on discount, it's $10 a square foot. But if you go higher end, you're getting like CB2 or some more higher end stuff. West Elm, you're probably looking at $15. But yeah, $10 is like the square foot is the minimum per square foot on the home.
Okay, so you can buy the house with normal financing. There's really nothing different in this case, right? So financing doesn't change. Typical 20% down, or if you're using like one of our 5% down creative financing options, that could be something that would be attractive as well. And that may be a way to make properties cash flow if you have 95% debt on it, whereas a long-term rental may not be positive cash flow.
Right.
We have a lot of people that bought loan products that were 100% financing or 95% financing, which is still available. So this is just something to think about, how to still make that property positive cash flow. All right. So whatever financing you use, you buy the house, you furnish it, $10 to $15 a square foot. There are national companies that will furnish, and local companies that will furnish the house for you and help you design. Jesse has great resources, and we can assist you with that if you're interested as well. What are the necessary next steps after you go through that process, acquiring the house, furnishing it? Is it a matter of just throwing it up on Furnish Finder if you're going to self-manage it? I mean, what do you typically talk to people to do next?
Yeah, well, the difference between self-managing here and self-managing like on Airbnb is it's a little bit different. The midterm is a little more cumbersome. You have to do a little bit more digging. You don't want to just list on Airbnb and like Iberia and just wait for somebody to book. That's what 99% of people are doing. If you want to be around in the next 5 years, you want to be a little proactive, like we talked about now, like reaching out to hospitals, asking for somebody, like exactly what I did, except we're not going to show up in there. We're going to call and say, hey, what agencies do you work with that allows us to have, that are going to send travel nurses? Or you go on Furnish Finder, there's what's called unmatched leads. You would call those unmatched leads and say, hey, I have housing. Is there potential for you to stay? You ask who their recruiter is, what companies they work for, and you start kind of reverse engineering who the people are that are coming into the market, where essentially you have your ear to the ground, you know who to go after, and you can find an opportunity that way to build your business. And again, like I mentioned before, all you need is one company to start supplying you with clients, and that's literally it. You start with one property, and like I did back in 2015, you end up with 20 something, 9 years later. So you can build just off of one specific company. That would be what I would suggest for people to do, is to really start to think about this like an actual business. And if you want to self-manage it, you got to put a little bit of skin in the game. Or if you want somebody to manage it for you and do all that, obviously that's a charge. But I do believe that if you want to cash flow, you definitely want to do it on your own. You can still cash flow when you have somebody manage it, but obviously it'll be a little bit lower. But it does take more work, and most people are just like Zach and Adam. They're like, I don't want to deal with this. Like, you guys handle it. I don't want to do all the work. I already have a W-2 job. I'm a passive investor. I don't want to deal with any of this stuff. So here's the keys. You take it over. You do everything, which I totally understand because it is more work.
So is that who, let's say I've identified, a hospital or an industrial company. Do you just call and say, who's your recruiter? Or like you kind of mentioned, or whenever you just begin this, who are you actually hoping to talk to? Like you mentioned, you talk to HR first, but is that who you go to at all first now? Or who do you need to talk to?
Yeah, well, there's a couple different things you could do. I'll tell you one of them right now, and this is something that I don't necessarily talk about all the time, but I'll give you an example. We just talked about Extended Stay America, right? I talked about that hotel, which is the largest hotel for, corporate workers, travelers, people that we just talked about, construction workers, things of that nature. I will drive by there. You guys heard of driving for dollars, right? Yeah. Well, I'm driving for contracts. So I'll drive by and there'll be trucks that are out of state, that are different areas. I'll take a picture of those trucks. Let's just say it's A1 engineering company. And I'll take a picture of that. I'll come home. I will call them in the morning and say, hey, I just saw your truck parked outside. Just to let you know, I have housing. I'll look up what that Extended Stay America is per night. I'll ask how many employees they have that are staying, and I'll give you guys an example of what happened with me. Dave & Buster's was being built in my backyard. I saw that there was trucks from Louisiana. Called them in the morning. They ended up having 5 guys that were staying at a DoubleTree hotel paying $200 a night. So 200 times 5, that's $1,000 a day times 30. That's $30,000 a month is what this engineering company was paying. I had a 5-bedroom house. I said, hey, I asked them, what I asked them all the details, like, what are you guys paying? What is going on? They told me, and I said, how would you guys like to save $20,000 a month? And they were like, how are you going to do that? Well, I have a 5-bedroom house. These guys can all stay in one spot. They can cook. They're all doing their own thing. They have their rooms. And they were like, of course, we would love to do that. So we ended up having those engineers that were staying at Holiday Inn. We saved the company money. So again, it's about solving problems, finding the need, finding the opportunity, and how are we able to save these companies money. That was 6 months of $20,000. So we literally saved that company $100,000 just by staying with us. And again, these corporate companies do this all the time. They're paying quite a bit of money to have folks stay in these hotels. But why not just have them in a house? So again, that's one way to do it. But yeah, we're reaching out and just asking, if they give us a name for a hospital or they give us a name for a company, let's say it's called AMN Healthcare. I'm just calling AMN and saying, hey, I just talked to Misty at the hospital. She gave me your information. She said that you guys have travel nurses that are coming into your market. Well, just to let you know, I have a property here, or 2 or 3 or 5, and I'm willing to serve. That's what we do. That's how we operate. And we want to make sure that your clinicians have a safe and comfortable place to do that. I would love to work with you. And that's it. And again, most people, 99% of people aren't going to go out and do that. They think it's too hard. It's too difficult, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, if you want to build something successful, you're going to have to get out there and do something that might not be comfortable.
You're like a detective, Jesse. You're super scrappy. I mean, calling the truck, getting the logos and license plates off the trucks and like hunting them down. That's awesome. And it is true that, that's more work than most people want to put into it. But again, I mean, that's why services like ourselves exist if you want a more turnkey option and explore this, great. If you want to, dip your foot into the water and try it out and then eventually take it over, like learn as you go. That's a great option. But we're always here to present different ways to be creative investors. This is the first time we've talked about midterm rentals. And this stuff is super powerful and exciting. And also the people that are operating short-term rentals. If you're in an area that's seasonal, as we mentioned previously, you may want to start exploring this to actually increase your income. I mean, let's talk about that. We have offline, obviously, Jesse, but let's, kind of the hybrid model. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite strategies. So most of us that operate, I have short-term rentals too, just so everybody knows. I'm not just a midterm rental guy. I mean, that's what everybody knows me as. But I have property that does extremely well during peak season, and we're just going to say April, May, June, July, August. Those are the peak seasons for the month. We'll, 5X, 4X, 3X long-term rental rates. And then during slow season, we'll get midterm rental tenants. And the crazy thing about short-term rentals, if you think about, the Dow Jones over the last 20 years, and we went and looked at a graph, you'd see all these like lines, right? You have these peak years, then you have the drops. They have the peaks and valleys. But an intuitive investor is going to look at how can I maximize my income and keep it steady all year long. And that's what we did is we find these peak seasons that work extremely well as a short-term rental. And then during the slow season, if you look at our graphs, we'll have these spikes with the peak season Airbnb, and then all of a sudden it just barely dips a little bit. We're just making a little bit less all year long rather than those big heavy dips that happen with, the short-term rental vacation areas. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity in that. Obviously it takes a little bit of work to figure those things out, but most people already know what markets are successful in the Airbnb side. And it's just doing a pivot. And again, I think an intuitive investor is going to want to cash flow or at least have stability all year long, and you can do it. You just have to plan it out.
Now, are all of your contracts with companies specifically, or are you also looking for individuals, or how are people doing this? Like, are any midterm rentals done specifically person to person?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that do that. I would say that's probably the basic way that most people will just list on Furnish Finder and Airbnb and wait for folks to book. Just like Zach was saying, I get scrappy with things. I don't want those people to stay in the property because at the end of the day, they're liable for whatever reasons. So if something goes wrong, they squat. I'd rather have a company that I know is worth millions of dollars that is maybe public that's going to cover the costs of that guest, even if they screw up the house. Because again, what can happen will happen, right? To a certain degree. But then you can get like with Gallo Winery, I have a 3-year term with them. Whether my place is booked with their engineers or not, they're paying us $5,500 a month for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Traditional rent there is $2,200. So for 3 years, I have this lease already for whether the place is booked or not. So again, I find that to be, I just sleep well at night. And not only that, but if I go get a loan somewhere else, I can use that reference. I mean, that's a fantastic way to cash flow. The banks are only loaning based off of a certain percentage of the rent. So if we have these exaggerated rents, I mean, that just goes a long way. And again, we're trying to serve these clients. It comes out of, we're wanting to create a space for them that's opportunistic, that's comfortable, that's close to whatever work environment they're in. And I think that's a big part of the game, how I operate too, is being of service. Again, we talked about saving money for these companies. And yeah, it takes a little bit of work, but again, at the end of the day, there's just so much more returns that can happen. And most people aren't doing this right now. But I think it's catching on for sure.
Yeah. So when it comes to some of these markets, you've actually come back to, some of the markets we've talked to you about and said, hey, what about this one? You've come back and said, yeah, too saturated. Yeah. And obviously you don't want to get into those markets. So how are you identifying markets that are too saturated that might look good? You might see, oh man, there's a lot of hospitals in this area and a lot of construction going on, but it might end up being a bad market. How do you identify the bad markets?
Yeah, a lot of the times the saturated markets have a bunch of Airbnb operators, and what they do is there's regulations they hit, or they heard about the new shiny object, and they'll switch over into the midterm rental. And what happens is everybody will drive their prices down to the bottom. You'll see, your next door neighbor was renting for $5,000, now they're going to $4,000. You got another guy that operates here, and they go down to $2,000. So it's like this race to the bottom. Those are the markets that I don't want to be in, because what happens is you're not able to get the premium pricing. Everybody's driving their prices down to the bottom. You're not able to capitalize on the potential for those markets. So again, it's just a race to the bottom. And we've seen that a lot with the Airbnb space, the Airbnb world, when it becomes saturated. That's exactly, you look at Phoenix, you look at even Scottsdale, you look at some places here in California, you see the prices just continue to drop down. And it's because everybody's competing with each other, and it's based off of price. But one of the cool things about what I do is that even in a saturated market, we can go after those agencies where, again, 1% of people, if that even, are the ones that are going out, driving by, looking at those properties, looking at the people that are parked outside. There's not many people that are thinking in that way. So even in a saturated market, we can still capitalize on it. But again, it takes a little bit more work, because again, these markets are just driving everything down.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. It's all about being creative and unique and finding the opportunity, not following the exact norm. While you could be successful having the same 3-bedroom, 2-bath that everyone else does in a market, midterm, short term, whatever. Yeah. There is a saturation point, and so it's the people that are either going to do exactly like you said, to go out and actually create the opportunity that most people aren't. You could also not have the standard typical box, right? Like, for example, a lot of the short term rentals that I own in ski mountains, these are very unique houses. Yep. Where there's just not a lot of inventory, and so we can kind of set our own pricing. Because we're unique, we're not the average 3-bed, 2-bath condo that everyone else has, and you only have this amount of rent that you can charge, and it's determined by the available inventory. Totally. So these are marketing is a big thing. I mean, these are just some of the ways, I think, to separate yourself out. Jesse, I want to talk about your portfolio now, and as we kind of wrap up, like other key things you would leave with people, or pieces of advice in the midterm space. If someone is considering this, whether they're looking to buy a midterm property or they currently have a long-term property that they're looking at converting. Oh, and I want to mention one more thing. That is one piece of advice we always recommend as well. And when we're searching for these type of assets, we always make sure that the long-term rents will still make sense. Generally, they're obviously maybe not going to be super as attractive, But in a scenario where if you're basing your entire strategy off of, at least for this type of investment, to partner with a company, obviously you want to safeguard if that company moves or shuts down or that project is done being constructed or whatever the case is, that the long-term rent still makes sense, of course, in those areas. So that's always something we like to look for. But I guess my question to you, Jesse, talk to us a little bit about I want to hear just last minute of advice for people looking to get into this space. But before you do that, tell us where you're at today. I mean, you have a large portfolio. I think I heard some numbers previously about cash flowing pretty high numbers with your portfolio now. Tell us about where you're at now and what's next for you.
Yeah. I have 23 properties right now. Most of them are in California. I have 6 in Texas, hopefully adding more. And we cash flow quite a bit from our properties. About 2 years ago, I got on Bigger Pockets, and at that time I had 9 properties and we were doing $1 million a year with just 9 properties. So I think a lot of times people think they need to have, 100 doors. They'll listen to podcasts and hear these people talking about all these doors. But in reality, you just need a few that really perform at a high level. I think quality is a lot better, and that comes with the midterm rental space. And Zach, you said something that I really appreciate. A lot of the properties we looked at from you guys, actually all of them, cash flow, which you have to make sure that you fall into that long-term rental category that at least cash flows, because you have to have an exit strategy. And I think you guys lay those out pretty well with your inventory. But you got to make that work. But I would recommend for people, Zach, 'cause I know you're going to ask me that, is to go and start educating yourself about midterm rentals. There's not a whole lot of people that are out there. There's some stuff on Bigger Pockets that talks about it. Obviously, I'm here with you guys. But go online, do some research on it, and really start to pay attention to what those markets are actually doing. Start to look at your hospitals in your market. Start to look at Furnish Finder. Start to look at, go to real estate meetups, find other people that are midterm renting in your market. Start to communicate with them. I think that gives you a lot of insight on what's happening in your market by other people, especially if you're thinking about getting into the space. Talk to people that are doing it already.
Yeah, and I find it interesting whenever you've talked about the, calling the companies, getting the people to do that. Just remember, a lot of these people, I don't want to say they're lazy, but they want it to be easy. They're having to house a bunch of people. If they're paying 30 grand when they could have been paying 10 or 15, they're doing it because it's easy. So if you can come in and make it easy for them, they're willing to do a lot, because if they say, I know if I send Zach, it doesn't matter if I send Zach or Adam or Jesse to Austin, Texas, I've got a place for them to stay. They're not having to book at, the, extended stay here. Just make it easy for them, and you can do wonders, it sounds like. So, Jesse, tell people the website to find out more about you and what they're going to find there.
Yeah, you can head over to therealjessevasquez.com or go on Instagram at jessevasquez.com. And there you'll find, I have a ton of YouTube videos where I talk specifically about this. I give a bunch of free tips on how to get involved and understand the space. I go into more detail about how to find these companies, what to say to them, how to talk to them, and what to look for. Just a bunch of tips on Instagram. I usually give daily tips on something to do or something to look forward to, or how to pitch your properties to other people, or what markets even work best, so.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, Jesse is a real estate investor. You heard about his portfolio with the midterm rental, and he's with AirVenture, and you can find out more about him, as he said, at therealjessevasquez.com. If you want to see the inventory we have, both the short-term, long-term, and coming up midterm, you can head on over to rentretirement.com and see everything that we have there. Schedule a time to talk with us. I really appreciate the time you spent educating yourselves today. We'll talk to you on the next episode.
Thanks for watching the Rent to Retirement YouTube channel. Check out some of our other videos, like this one, or this one here.